Johan Grimonprez, director. I give a little thank you. I give a little introduction and just a couple of thank words, but we're gonna have a long Q&A afterwards. And so I want to thank Field of Vision also to make it possible. And then there's usually 4 people I thank who are actually part of the film, and one is it's Sylviane Blouin, who's the daughter of André Blouin, who's a character in the film. She was a Pan-African freedom fighter, and she was actually, in a sense, because she became the chief of protocol and speechwriter for Patrice Lumumba, she was placed on that list by the CIA and also the Belgian Secret Service. She went on to sort of become. She befriended all most of the independent leaders in the first independent leaders in Africa, among Sékou Touré, Kwame Nkrumah, Abdel Nasser, Ben Bella, Frans Fanon. And in a sense, she was sort of involved with Kwame Nkrumah, sort of in that whole Pan-African idea of making the United States of Africa possible, also from the perspective of being a woman. And she's been written out of history. It's the first time the story is being told. She's been written out of history because she was a woman, and also because she was threatening for what sort of happened with the independence in the Congo, which was threatening what sort of were the resources that were part of what you're about to see in the film, the resources that were threatened in that particular period. The second person I'd like to thank is Belgian-Congolese writer Ikoli Jongofani, who he as a kid, when he was young, was kidnapped by his stepdad, who kidnapped with his mother, who forced him to marry him. And later on, he became his stepdad. He grew up with his stepdad, in a sense. Sorry about that. His stepdad was actually a filmmaker as well, and he graciously gave all the access to his footage, as well as to the novel that she's going to read about, to Congo Inc. Thirdly is Patrick O'Brien, who's the son of Conacruz O'Brien, who was the Irish representative of the United Nations, who then became the special representative for the United Nations Congo mission in Katanga, and he wrote memoirs and exposed the Belgian genocide in northern Congo. And so, although this is a film that zooms in on the black history out of the black page out of the history of my country, it still sort of goes in alliance with all the people that I invited in dialogue to be part of the film. And the fourth person that I'd like to thank is Sergei Khrushchev, who so graciously gave the access to all his audio memoirs of his dad and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and also the home movies that he shot. And so we have a Q&A afterwards, and then we can talk more in depth. All right, thank you.
Please join me in welcoming back Johan Grimonprez, the director of this extraordinary film. Thank you. So this film is such a discovery, I think, for probably everyone in the audience. It certainly was for me, but it was for you also, because as perhaps you mentioned, or perhaps people know, that you are from Belgium originally, but you were not taught this in school growing up.
Well, yeah, you grew up, it's a big part of our country, right? So we're a young country, younger than the United States, actually. And a third or even more, half of our history is linked to this country, right? And you grew up with all the images around you. But it was called the Empire of Silence for a reason, Empire du Silence. So as a kid, when I grew up in school, I didn't learn this specific language, story. And for me, the film itself was a learning curve as well. So, yeah.
Well, it's, to me, as I saw for probably the third time today, I thought of it as a story of betrayal in every turn, and involving so many different people, For instance, there's a moment in the film where, Kasavubu is trying to, in effect, depose Lumumba, and we see how that played out, but Lumumba says, "Il nous a trahi," he betrayed us. But there's betrayal by Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General. There is betrayal by Mobutu of his country, of his people. You have, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Tshombe, who is the...
Moshe Tshombe,
who...
President of the non-existing Republic of Qatar.
Right, exactly, who essentially is paid off. But can you talk about that really devastating theme of betrayal?
Well, I think the head of the MI6 in the Congo, Daphne Park, sums it up quite nicely, right? So she says, we don't actually sort of would go in and sort of mess up the things. We let themselves be messing up each other. And you hear also Larry Devlin, head of the CIA, admitting, in a way not admitting, because even on the camera they're also betraying themselves. Admitting and not admitting that basically, they were buying up votes.
Right.
And Mobutu was propped up with huge amount of money.
It's the CIA trying to cloak us in darkness here as all right, we're back. And this film is so deeply upsetting as it should be, and so tragic. And I think part of the tragedy is wondering what Lumumba would have become. Who could have become? He died. He was 35 years old when he was assassinated. Is that something that crosses your mind? Is it perhaps a parallel to Mandela, but someone who clearly that was part of the threat he represented of, not simply by himself, but really being a Pan-Africanist figure who could have really changed world politics.
Yeah, and also the country is very rich. You have the numbers at the very end of the film, where basically everything is. They called it actually. It was a scandal, a geological scandal. That's what they called it when Leopold II was grabbing the country as his own property. They called it a geological scandal because there's so much resources in the ground, and of course it's the mining industry for a big part, which is dissected in the film as well. That was sort of leading that sort of overthrow of Patrice Lumumba. But there is one in a recent book. I think it was a politician who worked at the embassy in the Congo, Belgian Congo at the time, who actually said, indeed, if we would have sort of not killed him, and if we would have advised a bit, he could have been a second Nelson Mandela. But it's true. You have to also know that Sékou was sabotaged on and on. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966. On and on. That United States of Africa was completely, actually sabotaged, and it was very threatening because what I would say is not a post-colonial period where the countries became independent, but it was basically a neo-colonial grab. It was the ground zero of how the West was about to deal with this independence movement. And it's basically a neo-colonial grab. And you talked about the corruption, but you have to know the global South gaining a majority vote, which caused that political earthquake within the United Nations, sort of also stirred an anxiety where sort of in East and West, because Nikita Khrushchev, the then Soviet premier, would actually propose the decolonization resolution, but it would also to actually get the global South in his camp. But the United States would send out the black jazz ambassadors, but would send in the arm twisters. You talked about the corruption, but there would be because that for me was also new. The interviews that we found at Columbia University in the Department of Diplomatic Studies, we found also Homeward Embry's audio, and where he literally saying that actually he was sending in arm twisters to buy up the votes. But he had a PR company right in front of the United Nations on 45th Street, which basically was a whole building of PR people, but this was an army paid for by the CIA, in a nutshell. And so that's how the West was about to deal with this independent movement. And I believe that Patrice Lumumba, with the complicity of my country, Belgium, as sort of a ground zero of how they were about to deal with this independence movement in Africa. And also it was inspiring here in the United States, it was inspiring also the civil rights movement. So it was not just the United States of Africa, there was also that Pan-African connection that was much larger, which the film zooms in on, and on a subconscious level, the music is part of that. But of course, it's not. This is not the focus of the film. The focus is about much more.
Yeah, in a way, I think Malcolm X is really at the fulcrum of that, of being a Pan-African figure as well. But can you talk about his role in the film, because it's really quite substantial. He's really a pivotal figure in the film, and can you explain why it was so important from your point of view to explore what he was articulating at that time?
Well, yeah, one of his daughters is called Lumumba, right? So he was very much inspired, but specifically by that independence ceremony speech by Patrice Lumumba, where he was grilling our king at the time. But researching, and for me, again, this was also a learning curve. I don't think, even in Belgium, the connection to Malcolm X, or even the civil rights movement and the relationship to sort of the independence movement with sort of the Belgian Congo being part of that sort of movement towards the United States of Africa. In essence, going through all the research that I found from Malcolm X, going from the way he was about to deal with the United Nations, because his first speech that you hear, where he says, well, with because we have to know 16 African countries became member of 1960. So there was a shift that suddenly the global South, and mainly the Afro-Asian bloc, could gain the majority vote. That was quite crucial. And he spills it out literally. So, the vote is as important, the ballot is as important as the bullet. And then on, like, the fact that he was about to drag the United States in front of the United Nations, but in coalition with all the African countries. For the way actually African Americans were treated in the United States as not being full citizens because they couldn't vote yet. You have to know, Louis Armstrong as a black jazz ambassador, also Dizzy Gillespie is sent out to represent diplomacy, but it's very schizophrenic because back home they couldn't even vote. So it's very schizophrenic. And so also there, I think Malcolm X spills it out in the way he sort of wants to drag the United States in front of the United Nations. And so going through the research in this film, first of all, the United Nations became very important because of that global shift and the 16 African countries being part of that, and it was labeled the Year of Africa. That the big shift happening in the United Nations was quite crucial. But Malcolm X alludes to it several times, and he's also about to actually take on that system. Again, the reason why also orange juices were sent in. And then literally in 1964, he's visiting Africa, he's visiting Ghana, he's visiting Abdel Nasser. And he's living at the time actually with Maya Angelou in Accra, in Ghana. And he's actually also visiting the Congo. And there literally he sees what's going on with the bombing. And he draws parallels, of course, with the civil rights movement. And when he literally says, you cannot understand Mississippi if you don't understand the Congo, for me, in a nutshell, that sums up a part of the structure of the film as well. And so that overlap, the way he was able to also criticize Moshe Chombe, it more and more, I dig into the speeches because I listened to a lot of this. All of them I could find, I listened to all the speeches of Malcolm X, and each time taking notes, where does he refer to Congo, and very often he does. He also, like, at one point, he was about to actually organize the Bandung Top in Harlem. At that specific spot, you have the Hotel Teresa, which is on the 25th Street and 7th Avenue, where he had his headquarters, and also where Fidel Castro stayed, but where Louis Michaud had his bookstore. This was sort of the center of all this movement, where also Malcolm X used to have his speeches in front of Louis Michaud bookstore, but also where Abbie Lincoln, together with Maya Angelou and Rosa Guy, were actually putting forth that actually they wanted to have that protest at the Security Council was organized by the Louis Michaud bookstore, in front of Louis Michaud bookstore, so it was an important one. But he wanted to organize a Bandung Top also in Harlem. And spontaneously, by him inviting Fidel Castro to the Hotel Harlem, the Teresa Hotel in Harlem, made actually that you had sort of a mini alternative top also while the United Nations was happening. It's Fidel Castro is meeting Nikita Khrushchev on the sidewalk in front of the Hotel Teresa for the first time. But you have Abdel Nasser coming over to talk, and on the sidewalk, it was a huge thing where a lot of Arab people were also part of that sort of gathering on 125th and 7th Avenue. You have Jawaharlal Nehru, and you have Kwame Nkrumah. They're all visiting the Hotel Teresa. So all these moments sort of made for me that actually there is this connections, and there's more. There's actually a lot that is not in the film, and that's actually things that I was also surprised about. That actually in 1964 he met Che Guevara also around Harlem, who was staying in Hotel Teresa, and they were about to actually organize an army of black mercenaries. Anyway, I'm getting off tangent, I'm getting off topic, but there was more that actually that I thought was interesting. Also, Che Guevara in 1965 went to the Congo. If he would have met with Malele, like he was actually at the side of Tanzania in the East Congo, but the Leone Abo and Mulele movement in the Quilo province was still further apart. If they would have met, that also would have had a big change. What was happening within the rebellion in Congo itself. But he starts his book, Che Guevara to Fidel Castro, saying this is a story of a failure. But there's much more that actually that I think is not sort of talked about in the film, but sort of sets the way of like some things that I think that has hardly been researched. Mm-hmm. Also the fact that the decolonization resolution was proposed by Nikita Khrushchev, I also was surprised. I didn't know that. I didn't know that he actually initiated it. That there's something there that has not been researched, which is a pivotal point where all those actually stories cross. Being United Nations, the decolonization movement, also the decolonization resolution meant a lot for what was about to ensue with the Global South within the United Nations. That story has not been written. And then Malcolm X's part and the civil rights movement in connection to the independence movement in Africa is something that has hardly been written about, that I thought Malcolm X is sort of the focus of bringing that all together in the film.
I mean, what you have in the film is so extraordinarily complex. It just stuns me at what you were able to synthesize in the film. Of course, you're talking about the jazz, and the edit of the film is really incredible because it's kind of a syncopated edit. It's just amazing how you edit the film very much to jazz, and the performances that you found and how you weave them together. I mean, can you talk about that? Obviously, it was a very long effort of editing this film, which one can imagine it would take an enormous amount of time to try to find that rhythm and to incorporate the performances so that they comment on what is happening in the geopolitical sphere as well.
Well, I think syncopation is maybe an interesting word, because it's also what Thelonious Monk does with the keyboard, right? It's always, the note is not actually corresponding to what you are about to hear. It's always off. But it's also what Ornette Coleman talks about, this double identity, that sort of never being sort of the subject that actually is being projected onto you. And I think it's interesting that what one would call syncopation as well, in the sense of identity, in the way we try to explore how, if I go back to the music, that researching also the music, I could not but sort of think about the music as being a political agent, or at least a historical agent in that pivotal moment in history. And not just the black jazz ambassadors, which we already talked about in the way that it was very schizophrenic, and it's not because they were used as instruments that they're passive agents. Because, for example, Louis Armstrong was very much aware of that situation, refusing to play for an apartheid audience, or grilling Moshe Chombe, or changing the lyrics of in Black and Blue, he would change the lyrics, I'm right inside to I'm white inside to I'm right inside. Yeah. And so there's something of a syncopation there as well, as being sent out as a black jazz ambassador, not actually fitting that identity and trying to sort of deviate from it as well. But if the music steps onto the political stage, as people with like Max Roach and Abby Lincoln, very much initiating that protest at the Security Council. It was with the Women's Writers Coalition in Harlem that initiated that protest. It's the musicians that are actually present at the Security Council Paul Robeson was also there. We had to cut him out of the film because it was too many elements. But also Amiri Baraka, he never made it inside the Security Council, but he was outside protesting.
The playwright.
Amiri Baraka, the musician as well. And so music was inherently very much part of that history. And while maybe if music steps onto the political stage, we thought, why not actually taking the politicians as sort of lead singers or making them into sort of part of the jazz composition. So there's a back and forth between the politics in a syncopated way that I think the way we were thinking about the editing, you have, of course, written is my business, and you have Nikita Khrushchev already stomping his fist. And there is sort of a way where there's an overlap that I think is interesting. When Hitchcock and Truffaut had their conversation, Truffaut mentioned once, well, you actually portray your love stories as murders, and your embraces are like put on the scene as murder moments, and the murder is sort of portrayed as an embrace. And I think that sort of contradiction was interesting to think about what could we do with the music versus the politics. And that always, in a syncopated way, became sort of the way of layering the film in another way. But it's also giving, for me, it's the scream of anger is also in a sense where if the politics would be, as Daphne Park says, divide and conquer, the music would be sort of a way how it would actually, as a political agent, bring people together. Mm-hmm. That as well, it has that agency where, of course, it's a pardon my words, a fucked up story, and actually, it's what was set in motion at that moment is actually what's still going on in the Congo is even exponentially worse. Mm. But I think there's still that I hope that sense of like the anger of not agreeing with that story as well. Mm.
So we'll maybe open up for a couple of questions about if you have any thinking of that. I wanted to ask you, one thing I'm really intrigued about is this recurring image of elephants. The elephant that's like you see its legs and it's walking in water, and then there's the elephant water skiing, and another kind of disturbing image of this elephant being swung around, offloaded off of a ship. It's not the only animal that we see. There's kind of this octopus. I don't know if it's a real octopus, but I wonder about what you were communicating with that, or why that resonated for you, those images.
Well, the octopus is a papier-mâché octopus in Disney. It's what you see if you take the submarine cruise. If you take and it's something in the dream of Khrushchev. He was never able to sort of perform.
Not allowed into Disneyland. He can't pay his whatever admission fee was back then. He's not allowed in.
But the elephant is like, for me, it's a tough one because as a Belgian, where do I stand in this story, right? So here's a white guy telling the story about the involvement of my country of smashing a movement, but and for me there's a big difference between speaking with and speaking for. And I think I could not tell the story of Patrice Lumumba, but I could tell the involvement and the complicity of my country as part of that assassination as a way into that story. But that's where the elephant comes in, is for me, it was in dialogue, because I could not but make this film by inviting also advisors, but also inviting, for example, Yves Blouin, the daughter of André Blouin, and able to also tell that story that's never been told, but as a way how you tell a different story about Patrice Lumumba, or inviting Nkoli Jean Bafani, talking about the Congo, the algorithm Congolese, that actually all the minerals of every war, and still up to today, is sourced from the Congo, but nothing goes back to actually the people of the Congo. Or Conor Cruz O'Brien, who firsthand sees the genocide by my country in North Katanga, and then Nikita Khrushchev's way in, which that he literally did not say in 1960, we're going to bury America, but that he was mistranslated and said, we're going to bury colonialism. But for me, it was trying to listen, also the music was trying to listen, what does that history, or if I dig into the past, the traumatic past of what seeped into in the soil of my country, because I think Belgium, the capital is still built with rubber money. You know, all of Brussels is laid out with rubber money. It's sort of part of what seeped into the soil. And if you listen, I felt like if I want to tell that story, how do I listen? And you know, Cathy Payne is an acoustic biologist, and she worked a lot with whales, and then figured out that actually whales have a communal song. But then she went on to elephants, and there's a sub-bass, you know, infra and ultra sounds that we cannot hear, but there's something that happens within sort of communication within elephants that she has been able to study, and with digital equipment have been able to study it. But every hour or so, it's not that the males, because she also discovered it's actually a matricentric society. It's the grandmothers that lead the herd. Like I grew up with Mowgli, so I thought, you know, you have a patriarch who's leading the herd, and it's actually not. It's matricentric. It's the grandmother that actually every hour or so, they stop the herd, and they all stretch their ears for 1 minute, and they listen where they're gonna go next. And for me, it was the elephant. Of course, I stumbled onto elephant after elephant after elephant. You look at colonial footage, and then you see an elephant being raised out of a ship, or you see, at the same time, you know, we have the zoo in Antwerp. A lot of stuff comes from the Congo. You have the elephant on water skis, or you know, on and on. There's something with the elephant that offered itself. In other films, it was something else, like with the arms trade, it was different stories. The previous film, but that offered itself, and then when I asked this question, I feel I cannot but refer to the story of Cathy Payne, how she actually discovered that elephants listen. And for me, it's listening to what sort of those images want to give. I cannot explain everything myself. The octopus, yes. Well, the elephant, besides also being the national symbol of Guinea, but also the elephant. You know, we talk about the United States of Africa, so there's a lot of metaphors, but I'm a bit hesitant to sort of say, oh, that means that, or that means that.
Yeah. No, ambiguity is good and allows us to consider, keep thinking about it. I wanted to ask the audience a question of how many of you were aware of Eisenhower's complicity, or not just complicity, but ordering the death of Lumumba. Well, I'm glad that some people. Hi, Vera. How are you? I'm not surprised Vera knows that, but yeah, I mean, I must say it was revelatory for me. But with that, are there any questions that you might have? Yes.
Thank you so much for the film and for showing it here. I love this place. I was wondering if you've had your arm twisted as a result of making the film, and what you think about America's, like, our inability to make films like this, given our history of doing this over and over and over, and still continuing to do it. Seemingly like the CIA is in charge of everything.
You may not have been able to hear, but she's asking about whether Johan has faced kind of arm twisting and drawing the distinction between you as a European and Belgian making this film, and whether, so posing that question, whether Americans either can't or are not making these kinds of films.
Well, I always thought, yes, the CIA has the monopoly on assassination, but after researching and knowing that the Sûreté that actually was very much involved also with assassinations. And so, talking about arm twisting, we were in touch with the Belgian intelligence, and of course these are documents that are 60 years old, 64 years old. So this was the COVID time, and we had asked all the documents concerning André Blouin, and we knew there was a death list where she was mentioned as next to Patrice Lumumba, because it's in her memoirs. Like the first time she meets Patrice Lumumba, he actually digs up some stolen documents from the Belgian intelligence. And those documents exist, they're cables between our embassy in Kinshasa, Leopoldville, and the Sûreté, where there's mentioned that they had to get rid of Patrice Lumumba. He should be sort of get rid of, and André Blouin should undergo the same fate. And we had asked for those documents, but everything they could find, they didn't necessarily have to give us that cable, but we asked for all the documents concerning André Blouin, and there were a lot. And then they said, yeah, we collected everything, come in February, I think it was after COVID. And then we went back and they said, oh, but they have all disappeared. So talk about arm twisting. But still, it's something apparently that it cannot be talked about in the open. But you talk about CA, but I think there's a complicity on a high level that I think still exists. You know, what's going on, and it's sometimes a legal system. If you talk about Gaza and Israel and the United Nations, it's sort of the vetoes were legal systems of genocide, sorry to say. And I believe what's going on, because Dennis Mukwege, he's mentioned with the statistics at the end of the film, Dennis Mukwege and Panzi Hospital, and have to give it to our monarchy, because recently they went to visit the hospital, which the Kabila and Shideki did not want to visit. Now it has changed a bit, but did not want to visit the hospital that actually treating all the raped women. And these are 80,000 raped women. They're not raped, they're actually with bayonets even mistreated after the rape. These are the women that made it to the Panzi hospital, 80,000. But 1 in 10 in Kivu province is still, you know, that's the statistics basically. And this is still being kept intact by sort of the mining industry. It's still kept intact by legal ways, through the UN, through sort of bigger situations that actually, lobby situations that happen, that actually, the M23, for example, it has changed a bit because there's allegiances that changed, and the Congolese army is twisting sides, and then the army is also committing genocides. But the M23 is very much responsible as one of those private armies for the rape of women, and it's still being sponsored by Mugabe in Rwanda. And so he's still being protected by the United Nations and by mining companies that hold a hand over his head. And so it's still sort of happening, but in sort of a quasi-legal way. And so, and there's films, you know, L'Empire du Silence by Thierry Michel in Belgium shows completely the genocide. It's co-sponsored by Dennis Mukwege, the doctor that operates on the raped women. But Dennis Mukwege has been trying to bring his case in front of the United Nations and still not listened to. He has all the documents of the genocide, and again and again is thrown out of the legal case. The cases don't happen. And so in that sense, yeah, there's arm twisting that's happening on a higher level. But you know, I think the complicity is not just the CIA. It's I think the CIA is a tool of the corporatocracy. And so you have to know, like, and this is the previous film. The previous film, which dug into the corruption of the arms trade, which is a pleonasm, because there's no one arms deal that has not component of corruption, is what Andrew Feinstein, the writer of Shadow World, which worked on the film as a team. The numbers are that there's 3 defense lobbyists for every politician in Washington. And so, in a nutshell, Shadow World shows that foreign policy is for a big part being dictated by actually the corporatocracy, which is for a big part the defense industry. And they're actually sponsoring also the candidates. And so and this is legal bribing. The lobby system is legal bribing. And it's not just in the United States. There's more lobbyists in Europe, in Brussels, than actually politicians. So it's not just the CIA, because the CIA is easy as a 3-letter word, but there's a structural system that I think, you know, it's not even about candidates. I think there's a structural problem in place in the United States, but also worldwide, I think, that actually makes that system is held intact when it comes to the global south. I think if you don't look at that, then
yeah,
you cannot.
It seems like all the structures are like.
And I had hoped that the template, I had hoped that the template sort of leads to what's going on today, that actually is not different, but actually exponentially worse. And it's not just the murder, but it's actually, you know, the mining. Because it's also the Katanga lobby that actually asked Louis Armstrong to be sent to Katanga It was Strelens who was the one who was responsible for storing the uranium in Staten Island to make the Manhattan Project happen, to have the first nuclear bomb, who also is still sort of talking with, it's the same sort of corporatocracy that were Dulles, Foster Dulles, who had huge stakes as with his company. He worked for a legal company as well, who actually were protecting Amex, which is part of Union Minière de Haute-Katanga, which was the company started by Leopold II. The same with Dillon, the Undersecretary of State at the time. And it all leads back to sort of the way Ian Stevenson was working for a legal firm that had stakes in Amex, in Katanga. The brother of Dag Hammarskjöld was involved in the mining industry in Katanga on the other side.
And we see William Burden, the MoMA guy.
And on top
He's
of
an
that-
investor. That makes-
That's even more peculiar, yeah, because he's on the board of Lockheed. He's the advisor of the Pentagon. He's director or president of the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, and he's sent as a U.S. ambassador to Brussels. But he's also a secret spy. So there's the cables that actually, literally, together with the Belgians, he says the Belgians are toying with the idea of assassinating Patrice Lumumba. I don't think it's a bad idea either. He writes it literally in the cable. And it's three people that actually advised Eisenhower was William Burden, Larry Devlin, and Alan Dulles. And they pushed actually, of course, it was colored by the Belgians because the Belgians were labeling Patrice Lumumba as a communist to actually draw the United States in their camp. And he was not a communist. He says in the beginning of the film, I'm not a communist, I'm an African. And that's what Malcolm X also sums up at the end of the film, is that actually it's not socialism or Marxism or communism that are afraid of, it's actually sovereignty. People to decide for their own destiny, being African or being Asian or being Latin American. It's like people decide for their own destiny that actually the resources of a country should actually benefit the population. That's what's at stake. And that's very sad, actually. And exponentially has become even worse.
And that solidarity
So it was a long question for
among African nations is the great threat. And that comes back to the MI6 woman who's like, oh, you just sow discord from within, you play it that way, and you get people to destroy themselves, or ostensibly. But, well, I wish we had time for more questions, but thank you all for being here. And let's congratulate Johan Grimonprez, director. Wonderful to have you here, all the way from Greece.
Thank you, man.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And congratulations on making the Oscar shortlist as well with your documentary.